This episode is brought to you by the letter M. I'm sorry, I was just having a Sesame Street moment there. Now, M stands for the manual mode on your camera. So maybe you've heard about manual mode, but you're kind of confused how to use it. Now, I produced a groovy little animation that simply explains how simple it is, basically. It's just a balance of aperture size, shutter speed, and ISO. And once you get that balance correct, you get the perfect exposure. And also remember that if you make a change to one of those elements, then one, if not both of the other two elements need to be adjusted to maintain that balance. Doing a little dance there. Yeah, and the animation comes from my DSLR and mirrorless class, which is currently available on Skillshare. And there's a link in the description below. And if you click on it, it'll take you across to Skillshare and you'll get 2 months free. 2 months to watch 3 hours of photo tutorials. Brilliant, isn't it? And then you can decide if you want to stick with Skillshare because there's loads of other tutorials. Anyway, my tutorials look like this. Let's crack on with the animation, and as I say, I'm sure you're going to love it, and I'll see you a little bit later on. So let's introduce our 3 exposure elements into the mix. We've got aperture, shutter speed, and of course ISO. Now at the bottom, I'm going to introduce an exposure meter. Now your camera has an exposure meter too, but more about that later. And you can see that meter is going to indicate if our photograph is overexposed, too bright, or underexposed, too dark. Now let's introduce an ISO value, and I'm going to pop in an ISO value of 100 because remember ISO is our method of last resort and we like to keep the ISO as low as possible. So let's pop it in at 100. Now, one of the things I want you to bear in mind is this is the principle, this is how things work. And don't get hung up on the numbers so much, but just the relationship and the balance between the 3 elements. That's the most important thing. With that said then, let's make a start. Now with that particular aperture size, that particular shutter speed, and that particular ISO value, my exposure is perfectly balanced. Now how do I know that? Because I'm going to look at the exposure meter, and the little red pointer is in the center. And there it is. And that indicates to me that I have the perfect exposure. Now, as I said, your camera's got an exposure meter, but we'll look at that later. So let's make some changes then. Remember the exposure triangle. If we make a change to one of the elements, then at least one, if not both, of the other elements needs to change to get that perfect balance and create the perfect exposure. So let's make the aperture size smaller. So we're going to make the aperture size as small as possible. When we do that, let's have a look at how that's affected the exposure meter. And of course, we're now underexposed because we have a very small aperture and a very fast shutter speed. So there's not much light coming in through the lens and it's not being allowed to stay on the sensor long enough because we have a particularly fast shutter speed. So we need to make some changes, but that's obvious anyway, isn't it? Because if we remember back to the exposure triangle, if we make a change to one element, as I say, we have to have changed 1 or 2 of the other 2 elements. So in this case, let's change the shutter speed. Just simply make it slower. So I'm going to make it as slow as that gauge will let me go, down to a second. And now if we look at the exposure meter, we'll have achieved that balance again. And that makes sense really, doesn't it? Because we've got a really small aperture, but a longer shutter speed. So the light has been allowed to fall on the sensor for a longer period of time. And that has given us the balance. Right, I hope you're with me so far. Let's make some more changes then, because we can. Let's say I didn't want to shoot at a second. I wanted to shoot at a faster shutter speed. Maybe I didn't have a tripod with me, but for whatever reason, I didn't want to shoot at that slower shutter speed. So let's take it to 125th of a second. Now let's look at the exposure meter. and we're underexposed again, because the combination of that very small aperture and that particular shutter speed, it's not going to give us the balance that we need. We're not going to get the little red pointer or the exposure meter back to 0. So this is where we introduce our method of last resort, and we turn to our ISO, and I could lift the ISO value higher. So let's do that then. Let's take it up to about 320. Now, like I say, don't get hung up on the numbers, it's more the principle. And now I increase the ISO. When I look at the gauge, it's returned to 0. So you can see that when you make a change to one element, you need to make a change to one of the other elements, if not both of them. One more quick example then. Let's make the aperture size bigger. So imagine I decided to shoot a portrait, and you'll learn this later, portraits look better with bigger apertures. Spoiler alert. But anyway, here comes the big aperture. Now let's take a look at our exposure meter, and of course we're overexposed, because a combination of that now larger aperture in combination with that particular shutter speed, and don't forget we lifted the ISO value, we are now overexposed. So to balance that, I would first drop the ISO, because remember, we always want to keep the ISO as low as possible. So that would be my first thing. I'm going to drop it down to 100. It's native ISO, as we call it. But again, you'll learn about that later, but we're going to drop it down to 100. And now the needle will drop too. But in this case, it still hasn't returned to 0, because our shutter speed is a little too slow for the size of the aperture and the lowest ISO setting that we can choose. All it simply needs to do there is increase the shutter speed, and that will return our needle to the center and achieve perfect exposure. So I hope that animation sort of makes things a little bit easier for you to follow. So this animation in combination with the exposure triangle, it just proves that the three things are linked. And it's quite simple really, isn't it? You're always trying to achieve perfect exposure. Now more on that exposure meter that you have on your camera, and you can find it. It's actually in your viewfinder, and it will also be on the back screen on your camera. And you can see it here on the bottom of this little animation. And in this particular case, we've got -1, -2, +1 and +2. And there's our little green needle, and it's currently on 0, which would indicate that the exposure is perfect. So you can use that. Now, we're going to look at modes obviously later, and different modes that you'd put your camera into. Now, I would say that the little meter comes into play when you are shooting in manual. It does something else when you're not in the manual mode, so just bear that in mind. But yeah, it's a great little aid for when you're shooting in manual. Now imagine I didn't want to shoot a 20th of a second, because that's quite a slow shutter speed when you're hand holding your camera. Now I've got the camera at the moment on a tripod, so I'd be fine to take that shot. But imagine you didn't have a tripod. 20th of a second is much too slow. So let's put it onto a shutter speed that would be okay, which would, let's put it onto say a 60th of a second. Now if I half press the button again, you'll see that the image is now underexposed. But that makes sense because I've made the shutter speed faster. So this is where I would jump to my method of last resort, and I would go into the ISO and I would lift the ISO to a higher number. So let's try 800 and accept that. And then if I half press the button now, let's just see what we're getting. Now we're overexposed, so I could quite simply go back in and perhaps change the ISO. Let's take it to 400 and accept that and see where we are now. And we're still, even at 400, slightly overexposed. So I can easily just increase the shutter speed until I am happy with the result. And that is a pretty well exposed photograph. So there you have it then. It's simple, isn't it? It's just maintaining that balance, and you have your little exposure meter, and all you have to do is line that up at 0 or in the center, and that kind of guarantees that your exposure is correct. And that's how simple it is. It takes a little bit longer, But that's how simple it is to use manual. Now I hope you've enjoyed this video, and as I say, don't forget to pop across to Skillshare and you can watch 3 hours of me taking you right through how to use your camera, be it a DSLR or a mirrorless, doesn't matter. But above all else, thanks very much for watching this video, and you take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next upload. So bye for now.